Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing fine and dandy, and guess what I'd like to visit with you on, and that is something on foreign policy.
Oh, you're kidding.
We could visit about the Federal Reserve,
Yeah.
and we could combine it and saying, well, there is no foreign policy without the Federal Reserve. They can't pay for it. And we are going to allude to a little bit of excessive spending in what we're going to be talking about today. But what we want to visit with you and all the rest is this idea that all of a sudden there's a victory.
Yeah.
You know, the Pentagon came out and said, victory over Iran. But there wasn't a war. That was one thing. But 2 days ago, Trump said that we have to, if they don't straighten out, and if they do this, they want it, we'll eliminate, there'll be an end to Iran. And now they say, well, no, it's all been settled. I guess they want to take credit and say that intimidation and threats and warmongering, talk made the Iranians surrender. I don't see that as the case. It's just hard to figure out why it's on again, off again. But it was a pretty quick switch, and the Pentagon comes out and said, well, the threat has been reduced, so we don't have to. But be careful, we still have to be there because we don't want the Iranians to miscalculate and cause some trouble. So they're not packing their bags, they're not coming home. The ships are there. But boy, I'll tell you what, we really had a huge military buildup. Not that the permanent buildup in that region wouldn't be enough. You know, I used to argue, and I still believe there's some truth to this, that even in the Cold War, probably 6 good submarines could have been enough for retaliation, anything the Soviets would have done. But when you look at all the weaponry we had around Iran, I mean, ships and missiles and all that, and yet in the last year, think of the build-up in the last 6 months, last couple of months, sending more and more ships over there and personnel. And this was, a massive build-up. It looked to me like it was a semi-official war games because they did all this, and I said, oh, the danger's gone. There's no threat, but we'll have to keep an eye on them because we don't want to alarm the military-industrial complex, because they might think that if you don't have a little skirmish. I keep wondering, though, with all the pep talk for war and determination, from the Bolton crowd and Pompeo and Israel and all these places, what they're thinking now. They can't say, oh, darn it, but some of them, Lindsey Graham had a horrible statement this weekend about, why we had to be very, very tough on Iran. So anyway, the description now is that the Pentagon declares victory in the non-war, and they have been forced to put the plans on hold. So that's good that's happening, but that's not the best information. If it would only be a step in the direction of more and more non-intervention. But back to the old question, why do we do it? Why do we provoke? Why do we have those advisors in there? And then all of a sudden come to the rescue, and Trump comes to the rescue and say, let's back off. It makes me think about the story about the individual that's hit himself with a hammer, and somebody asked him, well, why are you doing that? He said, it feels so good when you stop. So they talk about war and scare everybody, and people remember what happened when all this stuff was going on with Iraq. Hopefully they remember that, to realize we don't need that policy. But all of a sudden, yes, we worry, and we've talked about this. Then we say, boy, at least now they're not going to be pointing as many guns. But we better stay here to keep a close eye on those Iranians.
Yeah. And the timeline of this latest event is fascinating because it was just a couple of weeks ago that Bolton and Pompeo were screaming about new evidence. We have new evidence that the Iranians are planning to do some terrible things to us or our allies. They're planning an attack. Bolton announced we're sending a carrier strike group and some B-52s out there. And of course, it turned out that had already been planned in the first place months beforehand. But he acted as if it was some new information. And now this sort of development of yesterday, I think, is We use it in our title. The word is delusional, because now Defense Secretary Shanahan, I think he was confirmed now, he's our defense secretary. He said yesterday, Iran was forced to put on hold its plan to harm U.S. troops and allies in the region due to the U.S. military buildup. He said, I think our steps were very prudent, and we put on hold the potential for attacks on Americans, and that's what's extremely important. Of course, they never told us what the threats were in the first place. Where did they come from? We found out later, actually, through an Israeli journalist who uncovered the fact that this stuff was coming from Israel itself, who is hardly an objective observer in the region. Right. They're pumping stuff to Bolton. Bolton is saying, I've got new intel, I've got new intel. He runs over to the CIA, I've got new intel, I've got new intel. And the next thing you find out, well, that didn't do much, so we have to claim victory.
Of course, the buildup was built on the fact that maybe somebody will participate in a false flag, but it turns out, I think, that this was an invisible false flag, and that's why they couldn't find it. But you know, the other thing that may be changing a bit to our benefit for our argument is, you know, the total failure of the coup in Venezuela.
Yeah.
A lot of credibility. Trump even publicly, said, "Hey, maybe this Bolton guy isn't as smart as I thought he was,"
yeah.
And he led me astray. So maybe they've been knocked down a notch, but that doesn't explain all the delusional activities that we do, go on again, off again, and building a troop, because the whole thing is. Trump is responsible for his personnel, and Trump is ultimately responsible for the policy. I mean, he can't say, well, it's Bolton that did it.
Yeah.
So
he's the boss.
This thing is very vulnerable and very wasteful. I was asking you that it'd be sort of interesting to know exactly how many dollars were spent for sending all this military machine over there. And, you know, and the other thing is where are the greenies? You know, the green movement, you have to give them credit. They don't like the pollution of the military, but I don't think that means they're anti-war. But just think of the amount of pollution that the military, I think they're the biggest
polluter in the world. Yeah.
And one of the things, and we should talk about it more someday, are those burn pits.
Oh,
they still exist.
Yeah,
in
sure.
Iraq, they're still burning it. And when you think we talked about the embassy yesterday, so we just throw it out in the garbage and burn it.
Burn it.
It's probably not only, it's probably one of the worst countries in the world. Because of our military being there. All the countries we go into, there's military pollution. Bombs lay around for a while.
Yeah. Remember, we had Kelly Vlahos, she's now American conservative. She came and talked to your lunch about it. She exposed this early on. But you talk about Bolton and his curious behavior. I went back and looked, because he's become a real Twitter addict. You know, he's kind of rivaling his boss on going on Twitter. Seems like he's had his wings clipped, and this may be sort of a Kremlinology approach, but he hasn't tweeted about Iran since May 8th, which is a while ago. He's tweeting on and on about Venezuela. It's almost kind of pathetic to see him going on and on when his regime change there has failed so miserably. But here's his last tweet, May 8th, basically 3 weeks ago. He hasn't said a word about Iran in 3 weeks. He said on May 8th, the United States will continue its maximum pressure on the Iranian regime until its leaders decide to change their destructive behavior, respect the rights of the Iranian people, and return to the negotiating table. That last part is interesting because it doesn't sound like Bolton.
Well, maybe what I mentioned, there's something to it. You know, the failure, in Venezuela, and maybe Trump, in his discussions, he may say, hey, look, are you getting me into something like you did in Venezuela?
Again?
Maybe we better reassess this.
Yeah.
I mean, that's conceivable. But of course, we'd like the reassessment before it starts. That's why we want to prevent the wars. They're harder to stop once they get started. And this would be good if he's moving in this direction, because when he says it, he sort of wants me to believe exactly. He says, I don't want to have a war with Iran. But then you wonder why he promises to destroy him if they don't do what he tells them.
And the whole thing about how putting the Abraham Lincoln and a few ships over there, the Iranians back down, and it really is, it doesn't pass the laugh test. And you know what it reminds me of, and you've written about this a lot, we've talked about it a lot. It reminds me of when the FBI picks up some loser somewhere, some guy, brain is fried, and they convince him that he needs to do jihad. And the next thing you know, he's wandering around trying to buy a gun. They arrest him and say, we stopped the terrorist plot. We stopped the terrorist. Doesn't it sort of sound like that?
It does. There was this big big threat by the Iranians, and now they're admitting, oh boy, they backed down pretty quick because they don't want to mess with it. And I don't think they want to mess with us. I don't think they want a war at all. And this whole idea that no matter where something happens, it was the Iranians. There's a few ships that got small bombs hit into the ones that were supposed to be sabotaged. Immediately, they're still investigating to see if they can pin it on the Iranians. But once again, the Iranians are probably more logical than people give them credit for. I mean, they're not suicidal.
No.
Matter of fact, they're not well known, as radical as they are, with religion. They're not well known for suicide terrorism. That whole culture is different than the Sunnis in Iraq.
And when we look at this, the first thought that crosses our mind is, well, what happened? What really did happen? It wasn't this, they backed off. And I think, and this is something I saw this morning, I'm gonna dig it up and link to it, I hope, in the notes. But as I was browsing around this morning, I saw a fantastic and fascinating statistic. 66% of Americans oppose a preemptive strike on Iran. So I'm wondering if maybe Trump or Trump's campaign people saw that and said, okay, John, calm down because this is a loser and I'm facing re-election.
I remember a statement, something like that. It was probably 1983, and we were at a Republican meeting, and the big argument was over what was going on with Reagan in Iraq or someplace. And one of the members got up and said, if we're continuing to do this, it was Syria.
Yeah.
Lebanon in '83. And they said, if you still have troops there, because he already had them there, but if they're there and they're fighting, you're going to lose the election. Within a couple weeks of that conversation, I heard, all of a sudden, he brought the troops out. So that is the reason why I talk a lot about prevailing attitudes in the people. If they have the right information, and I still do not believe people, all of a sudden, they have to be driven to hatred. They have to see demons out there and be convinced. And it's the noise they hear and the repetition that they have. They have to hear it over and over again. And all the TVs blasting away and the politicians. And these politicians, it's just a shame that most of them keep getting reelected, and it was so discouraging the other day when that letter was written. 400 members of Congress, was directing the president to keep the troops, send more troops to Syria. And he has pretty good statements about why we ought to be out of Syria too.
Exactly, and we are there illegally. We have no right to be there. It's not our country. Meanwhile, the Iranians, who are there legally and allies, said, hey, we need some help. We're fighting some radical terrorists, some jihadists, by the way, backed by the U.S. and the Saudis. So there's a huge difference. And in fact, interestingly enough, James Jeffrey, who's the U.S. Special Rep for Syria issues, is before our old committee today. He's before the House Foreign Affairs Committee today. And according to his pre-release statement, some pretty, talk about delusional and impotent statements. He said, the removal of all Iranian forces from Iran is still the U.S. goal. We got to get the Iranians out, even though they're invited in there. And here's what else he said. Talks about the Iranians' malignant influence, malign influence. Well, what were they doing there? They were killing ISIS. And then Defense One's national security correspondent, Katie Bowe Williams, she had a nice, interesting tweet line about this, and she said, well, how are we going to get the Iranians out? And here's what Jeffrey said. We're going to ask the Russians to help us get the Iranians. Talk about impotence. And here's what Jeffrey said. If Russia wants to achieve a secure and stable Syria, it should join efforts to counter Iran's destabilizing actions and malign influence in Syria. Yeah, the Russians are going to now join with us to try to kick the Iranians out of Syria. It's bizarre.
Yeah, military power and might is very important. There's no doubt about it. But having the moral high ground is pretty important. Defending your homeland is pretty important. But a point that we can easily make, and has been made many times, is think of the weaponry and the bombs that were dropped in Vietnam against a group that saw their homeland being invaded, both by the French and then the Americans. So this is there's power in that without having money and bombs and the military. And the military people aren't always the victors. And
Yeah.
this is why, they say, well, Russia and China, they're powerful and they shouldn't be ignored. But they're compared to what we have, and they're smart. They're ignoring the military buildup and they're taking their money, and that really bugs some people. They're going and investing their money. And what right do they have to invest their money in Venezuela and maybe solve some of their problems?
Well, I'll close out by giving a real heads up to our audience. Probably a lot of you, because you're so astute, have already been following this, but I think it's it's a top story in the Ron Paul Institute website today. But the OPCW, this is the UN organization that investigates chemical weapons. They investigated the claimed chemical attack in Douma last year. Remember, that's the one that Trump fired a bunch of missiles into Syria, costing us hundreds of millions of dollars. The final OPCW report came out a while ago, didn't have a real strong conclusion. We're just finding out there was a leaked report that was supposed to accompany this report that was done by engineers. The OPCW engineers report completely destroyed the narrative that Assad had anything to do with the attack on Douma. That was suppressed. This is a huge scandal. The mainstream media will not touch it with a 10-foot pole. Who suppressed the engineers report and why? It's a big story. We'll probably do some more on it later this week.
Very good. And I want to close just by emphasizing, timing. It's good for people to be anti-war, and I think the majority of people are anti-war. Special interests are for war. The military-industrial complex, people who think they deserve more territory, and they make all kinds of justifications to try to propagandize and with the war propaganda and get the people to support it, and they're able to do that. But since we really believe and expect people to, their basic principle is to be anti-war, but we all have to be anti-war before the war starts. You have to understand why policy is bad and why it isn't always, American exceptionalism is 100% right and that we can go and do anything that we want. But they say, well, you can't talk like that because then you're not patriotic. Well, I came around to thinking at one time that patriotism isn't doing whatever our government does. Patriotism is supposed to be when you challenge the government, when you know they're doing something wrong. And that's why we have strong defense for the whistleblowers and the truth tellers to get to the bottom of it. And if we did it before, then we don't have the struggle to get the war over with. These wars are still going on as much as, Iraq is still involved, and Syria, Afghanistan, we're less and less, but it goes on and on. It's that principle that we follow that is always leading to confrontation with other countries, and it's so unnecessary, it's so wasteful, and so destructive, and ultimately it's destructive to our economy here at home. But as 9/11 has proven, and all this war going on in the Middle East, it's so destructive to our civil liberties. And just think now how many challenges there are on freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So there's every reason in the world for people to understand and try to spread the message of non-interventionism in all aspects of our political life. Whether it comes to a personal liberty, our economic liberties, and certainly we ought to have a non-interventionist foreign policy. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.